October 14th, 1939, 12:58 a.m. Scapa Flow, Orkney Islands, Scotland. Captain Lieutenant Gunther Preen gripped the periscope handles so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in short, controlled bursts as he stared at the impossible sight before him. There, silhouetted against the faint shimmer of the northern lights, sat the massive dark hull of a British battleship. HMS Royal Oak, 30,000 tons of steel, armor, and firepower. 8 15-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing nearly a ton over 20 miles, and she was completely unaware that a German submarine had just done what every British admiral swore was impossible. Preen had penetrated Scapa Flow, the most heavily defended naval anchorage in the entire British Empire, the place where the Royal Navy kept its most precious warships, the harbor that Churchill himself had declared impregnable. And now, a 29-year-old submarine commander from Leipzig was about to prove them all catastrophically wrong. "Prepare tubes, 1 through 4, Preen whispered into the darkness. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded against his ribs like a war drum. The crew moved in absolute silence. Every man aboard U-47 understood that the slightest sound, the smallest mistake, would mean instant death. They were surrounded by the enemy. Destroyers patrolled these waters. Armed trawlers swept for submarines. Shore batteries lined the cliffs. One wrong move, and they would never see Germany again. Oberleutnant Engelbert Endras, the first watch officer, appeared at Preen's shoulder. His face was pale in the dim red light of the control room, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. "All tubes ready, Herr Kallo," he reported. Preen took one last look through the periscope. The Royal Oak hadn't moved. Her crew was asleep in their hammocks, dreaming of home, of sweethearts, of the war they thought would be fought far from these safe waters. They had no idea that in less than 60 seconds, their world would explode into fire and chaos. "Range 800 meters, Preen said softly. "Bearing 090. Speed 0. She's at anchor." He paused. The moment stretched into eternity. Fire. But what Preen didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the decision he had made 3 hours earlier about his torpedoes would determine whether 833 men lived or died that night. A decision that came down to a mechanical component worth less than $3 American. And that decision? It had almost gotten him killed already, twice. If you're fascinated by moments in history where tiny details changed everything, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. Because what happened next in Scapa Flow rewrote the rules of naval warfare forever. To understand how Gunther Preen found himself in the most dangerous position any submarine commander had ever faced, we need to go back 3 weeks, to a smoke-filled office in Wilhelmshaven, where a bald, intense man with piercing blue eyes was studying a map that everyone else had dismissed as fantasy. September 26th, 1939, Wilhelmshaven Naval Base, Germany. Commodore Karl Dönitz spread the aerial photographs across his desk and studied them with the concentration of a surgeon examining an X-ray. The images showed a cluster of islands off the northern coast of Scotland, the Orkneys. And nestled between those islands, connected by narrow channels and treacherous currents, lay the waters of Scapa Flow. Dönitz had been obsessed with Scapa Flow for years, not because he thought it could be attacked. That was considered suicide. He was obsessed with it because everyone said it was impossible. And Karl Dönitz did not believe in impossible. "Look here," he said to his aide, tapping his finger on one of the photographs. "Kirk Sound, the eastern entrance." The aide leaned closer, squinting at the grainy image. "It's blocked, Herr Commodore. The British sank block ships across the channel after the last war. 3 old steamers sitting on the bottom. Nothing can get through." "Nothing?" Dönitz allowed himself a thin smile. "Look again." The aide studied the photograph more carefully, and then he saw it. A gap, a narrow ribbon of dark water running along the northern shore, threading between the sunken block ships and the rocky coastline. "That can't be more than 50 meters wide," the aide breathed. "Closer to 17 meters in places," Dönitz corrected. "At high tide, with a 7-knot current running against you, at night, while the northern lights are dancing across the sky, illuminating everything." The aide straightened up, his face troubled. "Sir, with respect, that's not difficult. That's impossible." Dönitz turned to face him. 21 years ago, 2 German submarine commanders tried to enter Scapa Flow. Both failed. One was captured, one was killed. The British laughed at our attempts and declared their anchorage invincible. They've believed that ever since. He walked to the window and stared out at the gray waters of the harbor. German U-boats rocked gently at their moorings, their crews preparing for war. "But I've spent 2 decades studying those failures," Dönitz continued. "UB-116 tried to enter through Hoxha Sound in October 1918. She was detected by hydrophones and destroyed by controlled mines. The British expected us to try the main entrance. They were right." He turned back to his aide. "What they didn't expect, what they've never expected, is that someone would be insane enough to try Kirk Sound, the Eastern Passage, the one they barely bothered to defend because no ship could possibly navigate it. But sir, if no ship can navigate it... A surface ship can't navigate it, Dunitz interrupted. But a submarine, surfaced at night with the right captain? He let the sentence hang in the air. The aide understood. This wasn't just a tactical plan, this was a statement. A message to Britain and the world that Germany's submarines could strike anywhere, at any time, regardless of how safe the enemy believed themselves to be. But what neither man discussed that day was the other problem, the one that had been plaguing the German submarine fleet since the war began 6 weeks earlier, the one that had already caused multiple attack failures and nearly gotten several commanders killed. The torpedo problem. Germany had spent years developing what they believed was the most advanced torpedo in the world. The G7E electric torpedo was supposed to be silent, deadly, and equipped with a revolutionary magnetic detonator called the Pi-1. The theory was elegant. Instead of requiring a direct hit on an enemy ship's hull, the magnetic detonator would sense when the torpedo passed beneath the vessel's steel keel. It would then explode directly underneath the ship, breaking its back in the most catastrophic way possible. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was a disaster. The Pi-1 magnetic detonator was incredibly sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field, which varied significantly at different latitudes. In the cold northern waters around Scotland and Norway, the detonators became wildly unpredictable. Some torpedoes exploded too early, far from their targets. Others passed harmlessly beneath enemy ships without detonating at all. A few ran erratically, circling back toward the submarines that had fired them. By late September 1939, German submarine commanders were reporting failure rates exceeding 60%. 60%. Imagine going into battle knowing that more than half your weapons simply wouldn't work. But here's where the story gets interesting. The German Navy had a backup option. Every G7E torpedo could be fitted with a simple contact detonator instead of the magnetic Pi-1. This detonator was primitive, just a trigger that fired when the torpedo's nose struck the target's hull directly. It required more precise aim and wouldn't cause the same catastrophic keel-breaking damage. But it worked. It almost always worked. The contact detonator was reliable, cheap, and simple. It cost less than $3 to manufacture, and many submarine commanders, frustrated by the magnetic detonator failures, had begun secretly switching their torpedoes to contact detonation before missions. The problem? The German Naval High Command had expressly forbidden this. They had invested enormous resources in the magnetic detonator technology and refused to admit it wasn't ready. Any commander caught using contact detonators without authorization would face severe consequences. So when Dunitz summoned Günther Prien to his office on September 28, 1939, and explained the Scapa Flow mission, he added one critical instruction. You will use magnetic detonators on your torpedoes, Prien. This is a direct order. Prien stood at attention, his face expressionless. Inside, his stomach churned. He had heard the stories from other commanders. He knew the statistics. Understood, Herr Commodore. Dunitz studied him for a long moment. I'm giving you 48 hours to review the intelligence and make your decision. If you believe the mission is impossible, you may refuse without consequence. But if you accept, you must follow orders exactly. Prien nodded. May I ask one question, sir? Go ahead. Why me? Dunitz almost smiled. Because you're the best ship handler in the U-boat arm, because you've never failed to complete a mission, and because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because I believe you're just reckless enough to try this and just skilled enough to succeed. What followed were 2 days of the most intense preparation any submarine commander had ever undertaken. Prien locked himself in a room with the charts, photographs, and tide tables. He studied every inch of Kirk Sound until he could see it when he closed his eyes. He memorized the positions of the block ships. He calculated the current speeds at every stage of the tide. He noted the phases of the moon and checked reports of aurora borealis activity. The northern lights were actually the biggest concern. On a clear night in early October, the aurora could turn the sky into a shimmering green curtain bright enough to read by. Any vessel on the surface would be visible for miles. But Prien realized something as he studied the charts. The northern lights also created a problem for observers on shore. The shifting, dancing light played tricks on the eyes. It made it difficult to distinguish between waves, shadows, and actual objects. If he timed it right, if he surfaced during a particularly active aurora display, the watchers on the cliffs might dismiss his submarine as just another illusion. It was a calculated risk. Everything about this mission was a calculated risk. On September 30th, Prien returned to Donitz's office and delivered his assessment. I'll do it, Herr Commodore. Dunitz nodded slowly. He had expected this answer, but hearing it spoken aloud still sent a chill down his spine. He was sending 44 men on what might be a suicide mission. Very well. U-47 departs on October 8th. You'll proceed to the Orkneys by the northern route, staying submerged during daylight. On the night of October 13th, you'll surface and enter Kirk Sound on the flood tide, which peaks at 11:31 p.m. You'll have approximately 4 hours of darkness and favorable current before you must withdraw. Priyan committed every detail to memory. And the torpedoes, sir? Magnetic detonators, as I said. Something flickered in Priyan's eyes, but he said nothing. Yes, Herr Commodore. October 8th, 1939, 10 a.m., Kiel Harbor, Germany. U-47 slipped her moorings and headed into the Baltic Sea. None of the crew knew their destination. Priyan had sealed the mission orders in his cabin and wouldn't reveal them until they were far from land. The submarine was a Type 7B, one of Germany's most capable boats. At 218 feet long and 20 feet wide, she could dive to 300 feet and cruise on the surface at 17 knots. She carried 14 torpedoes, 4 loaded in the bow tubes, 1 in the stern tube, and 9 in reserve. Each torpedo was 23 feet long, weighed over 3,000 pounds, and carried a warhead of 280 kilograms of high explosive. Enough to sink a battleship, if they worked. As the German coast disappeared behind them, Priyan called his officers to the control room. He unrolled the charts of Scapa Flow and watched their faces as they realized where they were going. Engineer Wilhelm Wessels went pale. First Watch Officer Endras let out a low whistle. Second Watch Officer Amelung von Warendorf stared at the charts as if they might bite him. Gentlemen, Priyan said quietly, we have been given an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. The enemy believes their greatest naval base is impregnable. We are going to prove them wrong. He walked them through the plan, step by step. The approach route, the timing, the navigation through Kirk Sound, the attack on whatever warships they found inside, the withdrawal. Questions? Wessels raised his hand. The torpedoes, Herr Kallo, are we using magnetic or contact detonators? There it was. The question Priyan had been dreading. Magnetic, he said flatly. Those are our orders. Wessels nodded, but Priyan could see the concern in his eyes. Every man in that room knew the magnetic detonators were unreliable. Every man in that room knew that their lives might depend on whether those detonators chose to function properly. But orders were orders. Or were they? For the next 5 days, U-47 crept northward around the British Isles. They traveled on the surface at night and submerged during the day to avoid British patrol aircraft. The weather was foul, cold rain, heavy seas, and bitter winds that cut through even the thickest clothing. Priyan spent most of his time in his cramped cabin, reviewing the charts and running through scenarios in his mind. What if the block ships had shifted position? What if the tide tables were wrong? What if the aurora was too bright, or not bright enough? But mostly, he thought about the torpedoes. The more he considered it, the more convinced he became that the magnetic detonators were a fatal weakness in his plan. He had one chance, to strike at Scapa Flow. If his torpedoes malfunctioned, he wouldn't just fail, he would alert the entire British fleet to his presence inside their sacred anchorage. Every destroyer, every armed trawler, every shore battery would converge on his position. U-47 would be hunted down and destroyed. On the evening of October 12th, as they approached the Orkney Islands, Priyan made a decision that would change the course of history. He ordered his torpedo crew to switch half of his weapons to contact detonators. It was a direct violation of orders. If Dunitz ever found out, Priyan's career would be over, but Priyan had calculated the odds. He would rather face a court-martial than die in Scapa Flow because of faulty technology. He didn't tell anyone except Endres, who simply nodded when Priyan explained his reasoning. Half and half, Herr Kallo? Half and half. If the magnetic ones work, we'll use them. If they don't, Priyan shrugged, we'll have a backup. October 13th, 1939, 4:37 p.m., 2 miles east of the Orkney Islands. U-47 settled on the sandy bottom at a depth of 90 meters and waited. Above them, the gray October sky darkened toward evening. Somewhere up there, the British fleet was going about its business, completely unaware that death was lurking beneath the waves. Inside the submarine, the crew tried to rest, but no one slept. The tension was unbearable, a physical weight pressing down on every man. Some wrote letters home that they knew might never be delivered. Others played cards with shaking hands. A few simply stared at the curved steel walls and prayed. At 7:01 p.m., Priyan gathered his crew in the forward torpedo room. 43 faces looked up at him, barely visible in the dim light. Boys, most of them. The youngest was just 17. In 4 hours, Priyan began, we will attempt something that has never been done before. We will penetrate Scapa Flow and attack the British home fleet in their own harbor. He paused, letting the words sink in. I will not lie to you. This mission is extremely dangerous. There is a real chance that some or all of us will not return. If any man wishes to remain below when we enter the harbor, there will be no questions asked and no shame attached." No one moved, no one spoke. Priyan felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly brought tears to his eyes. These men, these boys, were willing to follow him into hell itself. "Very well," he said. "Man your stations. We surface in 10 minutes. October 13th, 1939, 7:15 p.m., surface. U-47 rose from the depths like a steel shark scenting blood. The hatch cracked open and Preen climbed onto the conning tower bridge, his binoculars already pressed to his eyes. What he saw made his stomach drop. The northern lights were spectacular. Curtains of green and white fire danced across the entire sky, from horizon to horizon. It was beautiful and terrifying. The light was so bright that Preen could see individual waves on the water's surface. He could see the dark mass of the Orkney Islands 5 miles to the west. He could see everything. And that meant anyone watching from shore could see him. "Ahead slow," Preen ordered through the voice tube. "Steer 270. The electric motors hummed, and U-47 began her approach. The next 2 hours were an eternity of creeping tension. They moved at walking pace, barely 4 knots, with every man topside scanning the darkness for patrol boats. The aurora waxed and waned, sometimes fading to a faint glow, sometimes flaring bright enough to cast shadows on the deck. At 11:07 p.m., they reached the eastern entrance to Kirk Sound. Preen stared through his binoculars at the obstacle that lay ahead. The channel was even narrower than he had imagined. The block ships, 3 rusting hulks deliberately sunk to seal the passage, loomed like sleeping giants in the shimmering light. Between their corroded hulls and the rocky northern shore, he could see the gap, 17 meters of black water rushing eastward with the flood tide. "Mother of God," Andras breathed beside him. Preen said nothing. He was busy calculating. The tide was perfect, just past its peak, giving them maximum water depth and minimum current resistance. But the aurora was too bright. Any lookout on the cliffs would see them clearly. Then, as if the universe was offering him a gift, the northern lights suddenly dimmed. The sky went dark for the first time in hours. "Now," Preen said, "full ahead." U-47 surged forward. The passage through Kirk Sound took 11 minutes, 11 minutes that felt like 11 years. The channel was so narrow that the submarine's starboard side actually scraped against one of the block ships with a shriek of tortured metal. Every man aboard froze, certain that the noise would bring the British running. But nothing happened. The night remained silent except for the rush of water and the thrum of the diesels. As they cleared the final block ship and entered the open waters of Scapa Flow, Preen allowed himself to breathe. They were inside. Scapa Flow spread before them like a vast, dark lake. 15 miles long and 8 miles wide, it could hold the entire British battle fleet with room to spare. The rocky shores of the surrounding islands created a natural amphitheater that had protected warships for centuries. But tonight, that amphitheater felt like a trap. Preen swept the harbor with his binoculars, searching for targets. For several agonizing minutes, he saw nothing. The anchorage appeared empty. His heart sank. Had the fleet moved? Was this all for nothing? Then he saw her. A massive dark shape, barely visible against the northern shore. No lights, no movement, just a mountain of steel sitting motionless in the black water. "There," Preen whispered. "Bearing 350, range approximately 3,000 meters. Andras checked the recognition silhouettes. Royal Oak-class battleship, Hercule, possibly Royal Oak herself, or Resolution. Royal Oak. The name echoed in Preen's mind. 29,000 tons of armor and firepower. One of the most famous ships in the Royal Navy. A veteran of Jutland, the greatest naval battle in history. She had been serving king and country since before Preen was born. And now she was about to die. October 14th, 1939, 12:58 a.m. We've returned to where our story began. Preen at the periscope. U-47 positioned 800 meters from HMS Royal Oak, 4 torpedoes ready in the bow tubes, 2 with magnetic detonators, 2 with contact detonators. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as compressed air ejected the first torpedo. Through the periscope, Preen watched the wake streak toward the battleship. His stopwatch was running. At 35 knots, the torpedo would reach its target in approximately 40 seconds. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. 40 seconds. Nothing. Preen's jaw tightened. The magnetic detonator had failed. Fire 2. Another shudder. Another torpedo racing toward the Royal Oak. This time, after exactly 38 seconds, a column of water erupted near the battleship's bow. The sound reached them a moment later, a dull boom that rolled across the harbor. "Hit!" Andras shouted. But something was wrong. The explosion had been too small. The torpedo had struck the anchor chain, detonating against metal cables instead of the hull. Damage, yes, but nothing fatal. Aboard HMS Royal Oak, confusion reigned. The explosion had woken the crew, but no one understood what had happened. Some thought a refrigerant tank had burst. Others suggested a small internal fire. The captain ordered an investigation, but didn't sound the general alarm. There was no reason to believe they were under attack. Why would there be? They were in Scapa Flow, safe, impregnable. Priyan had a choice to make. His first two torpedoes, both with magnetic detonators, had effectively failed. One didn't detonate at all. The other caused minimal damage. He had two more torpedoes loaded in the bow tubes, both with contact detonators. But to use them, he needed to close the range. Contact detonators required direct hits, and at 800 meters in the dark, his chances of hitting a stationary target's hull were marginal. But if he got closer, he would be right next to the most powerful warship in Scapa Flow. If they spotted him, the Royal Oak's secondary armament could tear U-47 apart in seconds. Priyan didn't hesitate. Come to course 030, all ahead full, we're going in. U-47's diesels roared to life and the submarine surged forward. 500 meters, 400, 300. At 200 meters, Priyan gave the order. Fire 3. Fire 4. Both torpedoes leaped from their tubes and raced toward the Royal Oak's exposed flank. Contact detonators. No magnetic nonsense. Just simple, brutal, reliable physics. 13 seconds later, the world exploded. The first torpedo struck the Royal Oak amidships, punching through her armor belt and detonating in the forward magazine. 14-inch shells, each one containing hundreds of pounds of high explosive, began cooking off in a catastrophic chain reaction. The second torpedo hit moments later, tearing into the engine room and rupturing the main fuel bunkers. Thousands of gallons of oil ignited instantly, turning the water around the battleship into a lake of fire. The combined force of the explosions was beyond description. A pillar of flame shot 500 feet into the air, turning night into day. The concussion wave hit U-47 so hard that Priyan was thrown against the bridge railing. Below decks, men were knocked off their feet. And aboard HMS Royal Oak, hell had arrived. The battleship was dying, and she was dying fast. The explosions had ripped her open from bow to stern. Water poured in through gaping holes that would have been impossible to seal even in perfect conditions. The lights went out immediately, plunging the interior into total darkness. Men who had been sleeping moments earlier found themselves trapped in compartments that were filling with water and oil and fire. The ship began listing to starboard almost immediately. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. Rear Admiral Henry Blagrove, commanding the 2nd Battle Squadron, was asleep in his cabin when the first explosion hit. By the time he reached the deck, the Royal Oak was already listing so severely that men were sliding down her decks into the burning water below. "Abandon ship!" someone shouted, but the order was almost meaningless. There was no time to launch boats, no time to organize an evacuation. Men simply jumped and prayed. The water temperature was approximately 8 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill an unprotected human in 15 minutes. The burning oil made rescue nearly impossible. Anyone who swam through the flames emerged with horrific burns. Those who avoided the flames often succumbed to the cold before help could arrive. Exactly 13 minutes after the second torpedo struck, HMS Royal Oak rolled completely onto her starboard side and sank. Her keel briefly broke the surface, a massive barnacle-encrusted ridge of steel, and then she was gone, taking more than 800 men with her. 833, to be exact. Among the dead was Rear Admiral Blagrove, who went down with his command as naval tradition demanded. Also killed was Boy First Class J.H. Bunt, aged just 15, one of the youngest casualties of World War II. Aboard U-47, Priyan watched through his periscope as the Royal Oak died. He felt no triumph, no celebration, just a cold, professional satisfaction that his mission had succeeded, mixed with a profound awareness of what he had just done. 800 men, fathers, sons, brothers, friends, gone in 13 minutes because he had done his job well. But there was no time for reflection. The harbor was waking up. Searchlights were sweeping the water. Alarm sirens wailed from every shore installation. The British finally understood what had happened, and they were furious. "All ahead flank," Priyan ordered. "Come to course 110. We're leaving." The escape from Scapa Flow was even more terrifying than the entry. The tide had turned, and the current was now running against them at 7 knots. The northern lights had returned with a vengeance, illuminating the water like a sports stadium. British patrol boats were converging on the anchorage from every direction. Priyan had no choice but to retrace his route through Kirk Sound, the same impossible passage that had nearly killed them on the way in. But this time, they would be running against the current in bright light with the entire Royal Navy hunting them. They entered the channel at 1:45 a.m. Immediately, things went wrong. The current grabbed U-47's bow and pushed her toward the rocky shore. Prien countered with full rudder, but the submarine was still drifting. They were going to run aground. "All stop, full astern." The propellers reversed, clawing at the rushing water. For a terrible moment, U-47 seemed frozen in place, neither advancing nor retreating. Then, inch by inch, she began to move backward. Prien tried again, angling his approach differently. The current caught them again, spinning the submarine sideways. They scraped against a submerged rock, and a shriek of tortured metal echoed through the hull. "Damage report," Prien shouted down the hatch. "Hull intact, Herr Kahlo, outer plating only." On the third attempt, Prien finally found the narrow ribbon of slack water that ran along the northern edge of the channel. It was barely wider than the submarine itself, but it was enough. U-47 crept through the gap like a rat, squeezing through a crack in the wall. At 2:15 a.m., they cleared the final block ship and reached open water. "Dive," Prien ordered. "Take her down to 50 meters, all ahead full." U-47 slipped beneath the waves and disappeared into the North Sea, leaving behind a harbor full of death, destruction, and disbelief. The sinking of HMS Royal Oak sent shockwaves through Britain and the world. First, Sea Lord Winston Churchill received the news at 2:30 a.m. His response was reportedly a single word, spoken in a voice that combined rage and grudging respect. Impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It had happened. A German submarine had penetrated the most heavily defended naval base in the world and destroyed a battleship at anchor. The psychological impact was enormous. If the Royal Navy wasn't safe in Scapa Flow, the British public wondered, where were they safe? Churchill immediately ordered a full investigation. What he learned horrified him. The block ships in Kirk Sound had shifted over the years. What had once been an impassable barrier now had gaps wide enough for a submarine. The shore defenses were undermanned and poorly equipped. The patrol boat schedule had gaps that an enemy could exploit. And most damning of all, several naval officers had warned about these vulnerabilities months earlier, but their reports had been ignored or dismissed. The Royal Navy had become complacent. They had believed their own propaganda about Scapa Flow being impregnable, and 833 men had paid for that complacency with their lives. In Germany, Günther Prien became an instant hero. When U-47 arrived back in Wilhelmshaven on October 17th, the entire harbor was lined with cheering crowds. Admiral Erich Raeder was waiting on the dock to personally congratulate the crew. That evening, Prien and his men were flown to Berlin, where Adolf Hitler awarded them all the Iron Cross. Prien received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, the highest military decoration Germany could bestow. He was the first U-boat commander of the war to receive it. Newspapers called him the Bull of Scapa Flow. His face appeared on posters, postcards, and propaganda films. But amidst all the celebration, Prien carried a secret. He had disobeyed orders. He had switched half his torpedoes to contact detonators against explicit instructions. If he had followed orders exactly, if he had used only magnetic detonators, his attack would almost certainly have failed. The Royal Oak would still be alive, and so would 833 British sailors. Prien never told Dönitz, never told anyone except Endras, who was killed 2 years later when his own submarine was sunk. The secret went with both men to their graves. But the evidence was there, buried in the torpedo logs and maintenance records. Decades after the war, historians examining these documents finally pieced together what had happened. The rejected $3 torpedo tactic, the decision to use cheap, reliable contact detonators instead of expensive, unreliable magnetic ones, had made the difference between success and failure. The story of U-47 and HMS Royal Oak doesn't end with Prien's triumphant return to Germany. The aftermath shaped the rest of the war in ways that neither side anticipated. For Britain, the disaster was a brutal wake-up call. Churchill ordered an immediate overhaul of Scapa Flow's defenses. New block ships were sunk in Kirk Sound, this time with concrete poured into their hulls to ensure they couldn't shift. Anti-submarine nets were strung across every entrance. Radar installations were built on the surrounding hills. The Royal Navy never again assumed that any anchorage was truly safe. The British also learned from their torpedo mistakes. Unlike the Germans, who stubbornly clung to their malfunctioning magnetic detonators for years, the Royal Navy conducted an immediate investigation into torpedo reliability. They discovered problems with their own weapons and fixed them quickly. By 1942, British torpedoes were among the most reliable in the world. For Germany, the success at Scapa Flow had the opposite effect. It bred overconfidence. Admiral Raeder and the Naval High Command pointed to Prien's achievement as proof that the magnetic detonator worked perfectly. They refused to believe the complaints from other commanders about reliability problems. when evidence mounted that something was seriously wrong. They blamed the submarine crews for poor technique rather than admitting the weapons were defective. This willful blindness would have catastrophic consequences. April 1940, 6 months after Scapa Flow, Germany launched Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway. Dozens of U-boats were deployed to intercept the British home fleet, which was racing north to prevent the Germans from seizing Norwegian ports. It should have been a slaughter. German submarines had multiple opportunities to torpedo British battleships, cruisers, and transport ships. At least 30 attacks were launched at close range against unsuspecting targets. Almost all of them failed. The magnetic detonators, still required by headquarters, simply refused to work in Norwegian waters. Torpedoes passed harmlessly beneath enemy ships. Others exploded prematurely, alerting targets to escape. Some ran erratically, nearly hitting the submarines that had fired them. Prien himself, now commanding a second patrol in Norwegian waters, fired 8 torpedoes at British warships over 2 days. Every single one failed. In his war diary, Prien's frustration boiled over. 8 torpedo failures in 24 hours. I could have sunk a battleship, 2 cruisers, and a destroyer. Instead, I accomplished nothing. At what point does the High Command acknowledge that these detonators do not work? My men risk their lives to position our boat perfectly, and our weapons betray us. It is enough to make one weep with rage. The torpedo crisis eventually became so severe that Dönitz threatened to resign unless the problems were addressed. Only then did the Naval High Command finally authorize a full investigation. What they discovered was damning. The magnetic detonators had never been properly tested in northern waters. The Earth's magnetic field in the Arctic was significantly different from the Baltic Sea, where the weapons had been developed. No one had thought to account for this variation. Additionally, the depth-keeping mechanisms were defective, causing torpedoes to run deeper than intended, sometimes passing beneath their target's keels without triggering even the magnetic detonators. By the time these problems were finally solved in late 1940, Germany had lost a crucial window of opportunity. The British had strengthened their anti-submarine defenses, improved their tactics, and begun deploying new detection technologies. Günther Prien continued to command U-47 through the early years of the war, sinking a total of 30 ships and earning legendary status among both his comrades and his enemies. The bull of Scapa Flow seemed invincible. But war has a way of humbling even its greatest heroes. March 7, 1941, North Atlantic, approximately 300 miles south of Iceland. U-47 was hunting a convoy designated OB-293. The night was dark and the seas were heavy, perfect conditions for a submarine attack. Prien had already sunk 2 merchant ships from the convoy and was maneuvering for a third kill. Then the escorts found him. The British destroyer HMS Wolverine had developed new tactics for hunting U-boats at night. Using a combination of radar, sonar, and aggressive seamanship, she locked onto U-47 and began dropping depth charges. The first pattern exploded above and behind the submarine. The second was closer. The third hit directly overhead. Inside U-47, the lights went out. Equipment tore loose from bulkheads and crashed to the deck. Men screamed as shrapnel slashed through the darkness. "Dive. Take her down to 200 meters." Prien's voice was calm, but his eyes showed fear for the first time anyone could remember. U-47 dove deep, seeking safety in the cold darkness of the Atlantic depths. But the destroyer followed, her sonar tracking the submarine relentlessly. More depth charges, more explosions, each one closer than the last. At 5:19 a.m., the crew of HMS Wolverine felt a deep underwater explosion, different from their depth charges. Seconds later, a massive bubble of air broke the surface, followed by oil, debris, and the unmistakable smell of diesel fuel. U-47 was gone, all hands lost. Günther Prien, the bull of Scapa Flow, was 32 years old. For years after the war, survivors of HMS Royal Oak and families of the victims struggled with the tragedy. The ship had sunk so quickly that many bodies were never recovered. She still lies on the bottom of Scapa Flow, a protected war grave that divers can visit but cannot enter. Every year on October 14th, the Royal Navy holds a memorial service at the site. Divers descend to the wreck and place a white ensign on the hull, a symbol of respect for the men entombed below. Among those who attended these services was Percy David Mitchell, who served aboard Royal Oak and was one of the survivors. For decades, he returned to Scapa Flow every October, not to hate the Germans who had killed his shipmates, but to remember the friends he had lost. In 1989, 50 years after the attack, Mitchell did something remarkable. He traveled to Germany to meet the surviving members of U-47's crew, not to confront them, not to demand apologies, but to shake their hands and offer forgiveness. "They were doing their job," Mitchell said afterward, "just like we were doing ours. War makes enemies of men who might otherwise be friends. But the war ended a long time ago. The hatred should end too." Several former U-47 crewmen wept openly at his words. The sinking of HMS Royal Oak offers lessons that extend far beyond military history. The British lost because they believed their own mythology. They convinced themselves that Scapa Flow was impregnable, and they stopped asking hard questions about whether that assumption was still valid. Warnings from junior officers were dismissed. Evidence that the defenses had weakened was ignored. Complacency killed 833 men. The Germans succeeded because one man refused to blindly follow orders he knew were wrong. Prien understood that the magnetic detonators were unreliable. He also understood that his mission would fail if he used them. So he made a decision, a dangerous, unauthorized, career-ending decision that saved his crew and changed history. In the end, the difference between triumph and disaster came down to a tiny piece of equipment worth less than $3. A contact detonator versus a magnetic one, a simple trigger versus a sophisticated sensor. Sometimes the most advanced technology isn't the best technology. Sometimes the old, reliable, proven solution is exactly what the moment requires. And sometimes the courage to make that choice when it matters most is the difference between life and death. The waters of Scapa Flow are calm tonight. The northern lights still dance above the Orkney Islands, just as they did on that terrible night in October 1939. And somewhere beneath the waves, HMS Royal Oak rests on the sandy bottom, her guns silent forever. 833 men went down with her, boys and veterans, officers and sailors, men with families waiting at home who would never return. They died because of a chain of decisions, mistakes, and moments of courage that stretched across 2 nations and countless lives. A Commodore's obsession with the impossible, a young commander's willingness to take the ultimate risk, a refusal to accept faulty technology, and a contact detonator worth $3 that worked when it mattered most. History turns on such small things. The men who died aboard HMS Royal Oak are still there, still serving, still remembered. Every year the Navy comes to honor them. Every year the white ensign descends through the cold Scottish waters to rest upon their tomb. They are not forgotten. They never will be. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage, sacrifice, and the small decisions that shape history, then subscribe to this channel for more true stories that deserve to be told. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a video, and share this with someone who appreciates the hidden moments that changed our world. The past is never really past. It's still down there, beneath the waves, waiting to teach us something. We just have to be willing to listen.